Today's News Talk and the voice of freedom. We're Today's News Talk, TNT.
And welcome back to the program, where I'm delighted to say I'm joined on the line from Sussex by Tony Greenstein. Welcome to the program, Tony.
Yeah, thank you. Good to be back.
My pleasure. First of all, anti-Zionism. There was a panel yesterday on another channel which you took part in. 6 very different conceptions, really, of anti-Zionism and what it means. But at least in the wake of Professor David Miller's victory in the courts, we can now talk about it as a subject, as a legitimate subject for conversation, particularly, of course, given that anti-Zionism is opposition to genocide right now.
Yes, absolutely. Well, anti-Zionism has always been legitimate. It was the first reaction of Jewish people to Zionism, because originally, when Jewish Zionism came on the scene, because Christian Zionism was far older, Jews saw it as a form of Jewish anti-Semitism, because the anti-Semites said Jews do not belong in the countries where they live. And the Zionists said, yes, we agree, they belong in Palestine, in their own ghetto state, a Jewish state. So it's always been legitimate. But of course, the establishment, which adopted Zionism very early on, wants to delegitimize it, because just as they want to delegitimize any opposition to the genocidal war in Gaza. And today, they're using Jews as the moral alibi for that war, which is why they're so concerned about anti-Semitism, not about any other form of racism. But anti-Semitism is the kind of false anti-racism, as I've written, of the ruling class. And that is true today, as it has been for many, many years. So, yes, we had a good discussion.
The irony, Tony, it really is, isn't it? You know, people have been writing, various Jewish groups have written to the Archbishop of Canterbury this week, asking him to distance himself from the Board of Deputies and the Chief Rabbi, because he seems to think they speak for all Jewish people in Britain when they don't. And indeed, again, Welby's tunnel vision, his assumption that all Jewish people in Britain are fans of the State of Israel, fully signed up to the Zionist project, is itself an anti-Semitic position.
Yes, of course, because they want to associate Jews and therefore the Holocaust, because people think of the Holocaust when they think of Jews, with what's happening in Gaza now. That's the same reason that Germany is so enthusiastic about the genocide in Gaza. I mean, because historically there's never been a genocide that Germany hasn't smiled upon. And that is true today of the Western nations. So, I mean, we've seen the collapse of international law, the collapse of really any morality. We've seen the International Criminal Court, which is still dithering over issuing arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. Remember back to the beginning of the Ukrainian war, it took them 1 day to issue arrest warrants against Vladimir Putin, but they still haven't, after nearly a year of genocide, issued arrest warrants against Israeli leaders. And to be quite honest, if they're going to issue an arrest warrant against Putin, then they should be issuing arrest warrants against Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, Olaf Scholz, and all the other Western leaders who are complicit in that genocide. So we've seen pure political and moral hypocrisy amongst our leaders, who've really given Israel everything they want. I mean, you remember Biden's red lines were Rafah. Well, Israel has been in Rafah quite some time, and where are the red lines? They're now ensconced in the Philadelphia corridor, and so it goes on. I suppose the good thing about it is that Israel is meeting very heavy resistance in Gaza. It wasn't a walk through the park as they thought, and they've taken clearly quite significant casualties, far, far higher than the ones they publicly declare. So Israel is finding itself besieged, and that's why we're seeing the mass demonstrations in support of getting the hostages back, because for Netanyahu and the right wing in the cabinet, the hostages are dispensable. They're a price worth paying. to once again try and eliminate Palestinian resistance. We've now seen the war spread to the West Bank. Jenin, 70% of the roads have been demolished, houses have been demolished, people have been forced onto the streets. We're seeing a replay of Gaza as Israel continues its ethnic cleansing project. So that is the reality we face today.
A couple of points to pick up on. I would add David Cameron to that list of people who should be arrested, particularly since a source in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office told The Guardian yesterday that he sat on advice saying that it was highly likely Britain was complicit in international war crimes and crimes against humanity. He did nothing. That is worse than simply a dereliction of duty. In my view, it's criminal, Tony. But are we going to get a knock on the door from the secret police for saying so?
Well, I suspect you won't, because you're not in Britain, but possibly I
not
could.
For the moment.
Not at the moment. But yes, of course, David Cameron is complicit and he's a war criminal. So is Anthony Blinken, who is excused and covered for Israel throughout the genocide. But there are so many war criminals, you have to pick and choose who you can prosecute, I guess. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be much enthusiasm for doing so.
Well, I can't help thinking that the three judges responsible for actually issuing those arrest warrants are being lent on or threatened, very possibly. We don't know.
Without a doubt, Trump sanctioned the International Criminal Court when he was in power. But I mean, the Biden administration is clearly and obviously putting maximum pressure on them. And that really just shows the charade of the Western justice system when it comes to it. It's not neutral. It doesn't simply look at a situation regardless of those pressures. It very much succumbs to the political pressures put upon it. As I say, the contrast between Putin and what's happening now is so stark that you can't explain it other than by the fact that the ICC is in essence a Western creation and a creation of Western imperialism. And that's why it's mainly gone just after African dictators. They're easy pickings. But when it comes to the responsible, there is absolute immunity.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid you're right. I mean, I've called it a global constitutional crisis, quite frankly, but it's one that the corporate media prefer to ignore, just as they prefer to ignore the killing fields in Gaza. 42 people killed today. There won't be a single word about it on the BBC tonight, I shouldn't wonder. But if 42 Israelis had been killed today, it would be all over the headlines for the next week. The wailing and gnashing of teeth wouldn't stop. We're going to take a very short break for the headlines. When we come back, I want to talk about the arrest last week of Sarah Wilkinson and the words fail me, Tony, as to how she was treated. We'll be right back after this short break.
Want to be a part of the conversation? Then let us know on the TNT Radio Interactive Live Chat Room, lighting the fuse for freedom. TNT.
And welcome back to the program. Without further ado, Tony, Rishi Sunak, of course, draped himself in the Israeli flag after October the 7th and said to Benjamin Netanyahu, "We want you to win." I don't know if the situation in Gaza with children drinking out of puddles and cats and dogs eating the remains of people who've been blown apart is of what he had in mind. We all hoped that there would be a sea change under the incoming Labour government, although I didn't really bet on it, put it that way. But it seems in terms of the crackdown on reportage from Gaza, something that Israel has been very keen to do, something highlighted by Jonathan Cook in his latest article, the tentacles have spread to this country. Israel has killed 170 odd journalists in Gaza, more than were killed in the Second World War, because they don't want what's happening there to get out. And now they are using the same tactics to strangle journalists in the West. Richard Medhurst was arrested at the airport when he came to speak to an event. And as for Sarah Wilkinson, the desecration of her mother's ashes, the refusal to give her medicine for Crohn's disease. I mean, the litany of, frankly, offences committed against her during her arrest last week on terrorism charges breaks new ground in Britain and of entirely the wrong kind, Tony.
Well, yes, I mean, that's right. I mean, I was arrested on the 20th of December last year under the same provision of the Terrorism Act, Section 12(1)(a) of the Terrorism Act 2000. They're using the allegation of terrorism in order to silence anyone who speaks out. And they've done this by prescribing not just the military, but the political wing of Hamas, which is outrageous. There is no justification whatsoever. Hamas is the elected government of Hamas by the Palestinians. You may like them or you may not like them, but that is the situation. And if we'd done that in Ireland and prescribed Sinn Féin, which was the political wing of the IRA, then there would have been no Good Friday Agreement. But the police, who are so eager to implement an obscure clause of the Terrorism Act, which was only introduced in 2021, are remarkably reluctant to implement and enforce the International Criminal Court Act of 2001, which makes support for or aiding war crimes in this country or abroad an offence. There is no attempt to enforce that. So the police pick and choose which piece of legislation they wish to implement. And that's clearly a political decision. And what happened to Sarah Wilkinson, who I know very well, is an absolute outrage. She's not a terrorist. She's never been part of a terrorist group, but she's an ardent advocate for Palestine. And that's why she has been picked up and subject to this quite horrendous raid. I mean, my experience was the police were quite polite and courteous, but in her case, I mean, they've been downright abusive. They've stolen, she says, £200. They trashed the urns. They left the place in a complete mess. They refused to give, as you say, her medicines. They refused to give her any food. I mean, their behaviour is outrageous. But under Keir Starmer, well, Starmer is really just a continuation of Rishi Sunak. I mean, you couldn't put a piece of paper between them politically, so it is not a surprise.
No, it isn't. Starmer seems intent on creating as many enemies as possible, amongst the British people, certainly. What do you think the future holds? I mean, we have to keep talking about these issues. We have to keep campaigning, marching, so on and so forth, in spite of this repression. But what I'm disappointed in is that so far, and correct me if I'm wrong, I've seen no pushback from any so-called left-wing Labour MPs or from any aspect of the sort of establishment left-wing media, shall we say, about Sarah's treatment.
Well, I'm not sure there is any left-wing establishment media, unless you're referring to The Guardian, and that's...
Well, sort of. I'm sort of mean Tribune or even, the New Statesman, maybe, Those were the days, Tony.
I don't think the New Statesman counts as left-wing by anyone's judgment. I think there's unanimity in support of Israel amongst the establishment. Israel is the West's guard dog in the Middle East. It is the guarantor of the stability of the corrupt and repressive Arab regimes. Israel, in a sense, is the linchpin of the West, and therefore they will go to any lengths and they will excuse any actions by Israel because they don't want to destabilize it. But the reality is, I think, and Ilan Pappé is right in this, that Israel's time and existence as a Jewish state is extremely time limited. It is an inherently unstable state. It's clearly, even within the settler population, there are massive divisions. And it has shown that without American support, it cannot even defeat the Palestinians. The Americans have been pouring weapons in to support the genocide like there was no tomorrow. So I think we are looking at the beginning of the end of Zionism, and about time too. And of course, there will be people in the Jewish establishment like that racist Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, who will complain that they're not killing enough and they should be supplying more weapons. I mean, this is the kind of degeneration of the Jewish religion, or the Orthodox Jewish religion, as perpetuated by the Jewish establishment. I mean, the man is really without any moral excuse or justification. But that's what's happened. Most of the Jewish religion has been Zionized, and Mervis is part of that. Anyway, I hope that is of some help.
Yeah, that's great, Tony. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution. Look forward to having you on for a deeper dive at some point in the not too distant future. Tony Greenstein, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye. There he goes. That's Tony Greenstein. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, a bonus. Brian Hesher-McLean joins me with the latest from the Lone Star State of Texas. We'll be right back after this short break.
Basil Valentine on today's News Talk, TNT.